James, I've been meaning to catch up with you for quite some time because I discovered from a phone call you gave me a few weeks ago that I was looking out the back window of the car instead of looking out the front window of the car when it came to the World Health Organization and the changes to the regulations. So you seem to be really nailing it down from our engagement in between. So I'm delighted to catch up with you and introduce you to an Irish audience and get them to have a better and deeper understanding about what we're looking at here. Now, one of the things that fascinates me from what you've already said is that you see what's going on effectively as like an international mafia type of an arrangement, kind of a mixture of corporate power and basically an institution that seems to have completely lost its way or has been subverted in some way. Can you start there and maybe explain what you see and why you see it the way you see it?
Well, I really like your analogy about looking through the rear view mirror because many people are talking about documents that are over a year old. And a little bit more than a week ago, I revealed a leaked version of the proposed amendments to the international health regulations. And I might as well have dropped them into a black hole because I seem to be the only one who's talking about the latest information. The same thing somewhat applies to the other set of negotiations, the treaty. On March 13th, there was a new version of it. And as we speak, the WHO is in the middle of 2 weeks of negotiations. And so understanding that those two things are going on and the sands are shifting under us, we need to be able to adapt to the latest information. And I'm glad we have this opportunity to talk about this. Thank you so much. I think it's important to understand what is attempting to be achieved by the proposed amendments to the international health regulations, which is very different from what is attempting to be achieved by the other negotiations. And if we're not aiming at the target that is currently in front of us, we're going to miss it. And I published an article the other day summarizing all of this. We've got about 2 months to flatten the WHO, and now's the time to come together and focus accurately on what is really going on.
James, can I just pause you there, just for the Irish audience, so that a clear understanding? Can you just explain the regulations, which I know is a historic thing that's now in a state of movement, and the pandemic agreement, or the conference framework that they're setting up, and why these two things are happening together? Can you just wind us back a small bit and then bring us quickly forward, if that's okay?
I will, and let me ask you this, Eddie. If we, I'll lay out the two and distinguish them, but then let's try our best to talk about one of them, and then put a line in the sand,
Okay.
and then talk about the other one. Because one of the problems that's been going on for the last almost 2 years now is the information has gotten commingled, and so a lot of confusion has ensued. And so, starting with the international health regulations, first and foremost, they are a separate existing document, which personally, my opinion, I feel that they were never properly adopted by all of the nations. What happened, I don't know where you were. I know exactly where I was when they were landing on the moon, or however that happened back in July of 1969. But that is when there was the 22nd meeting of the of the World Health Assembly. And that is when they adopted the international health regulations in July of 1969. Well, everyone was talking about the moon. Nobody was paying attention to the meeting where they agreed to this new international agreement. And to my knowledge, it was not formally adopted by any of the nations. The process by which they operate the amendments is they gave all of the nations 9 months to object to them. And since nobody objected, it just slid right into being accepted as an international agreement. Fast forward to 2005, they went through large changes. Amendments were, supposedly adopted. The same thing happened. There was no formal ratification that I've been able to find anywhere. They gave a time period, and that time period passed, and it was just generally accepted. I think it's very important to understand what the international health regulations actually are. The purpose of the 2005 amendments was to expand them to consider many more contagious diseases than the original 1969 version. But the idea was to encourage nations to be open and transparent, that if something was going on inside of their country, they would let the WHO know as soon as possible without being afraid that there would be some sort of retribution by all of the other countries in terms of travel or trade restrictions. And it's very important to understand what happened in 2005. They required that every nation have an office inside your own government called the National IHR Focal Point that is in 24/7 communication with the WHO. And it expanded beyond just border control, right? Where, if some ship was coming in and there were, rats on board or something like that, fruit flies or whatever it might be, um, it it went into each nation where the focal point office is obligated to surveil your government's healthcare system and report on any outbreaks inside your country, not just at the borders, but including the borders. Well, what they're trying to do now with some of the aspects of these negotiations is go beyond just reporting on the outbreak of disease. They want there to be a search for pathogens with pandemic potential. It's as if they are looking for a problem rather than reporting on a problem. And so, with what's going on in the current amendments, you have to understand that the issues at hand deal primarily with international travel and trying to restrict some sort of retribution in terms of um, travel restrictions. Now, to summarize what's going on with this new version of the amendments that are currently being negotiated, they want to increase the likelihood of quarantining people who are traveling. This is something that most people are
Yeah.
not talking about. It's in Articles 24 and 27 and loosely associated with a couple of the other annexes. Their idea is that if someone is traveling, when they disembark, if they are deemed to be a risk, they want to strengthen the ability to quarantine people when they are traveling, either on board or in some facility in the country. Now, here's the problem: why this is so sneaky. To be honest with you, when you're traveling and you're in or trying to enter into another nation, um, you are kind of sort of at their mercy. Your constitutional
Yeah. You've no
rights in
rights.
your nation, um, they protect you maybe to a certain degree just through how nations treat other nations' citizens. But the sneaky aspect of what they're doing here and the confusing nature of it is it's not about your nation saying that you can't travel or that you have to have a jab or a test or a certificate or whatever. It's another nation saying, well, if you want to come into our nation, then you have to do this, that, and the other thing. And so a lot of people will say, well, I don't care. I don't travel. All right. But for the people who see that as a violation of their rights, the problem is it's not a constitutional violation. I'll give you a very, very good example. Novak Djokovic, the tennis player, the, the tennis player tried to come into the United States to play in a tennis tournament. And the United States said, well, you're not a citizen, so we can treat you differently than we treat our own citizens. And it's a very ingenious way where each nation, if they are infringing on the rights of citizens of all other nations, the net effect is, even if we were to leave the WHO, even if we were to reject these amendments, even if we said no, if all of the other nations are treating us that way, we can't move about the planet freely. And to use a test of some kind, a diagnostic test, or a requirement that you have to be vaccinated with injectables that don't stop transmission, don't stop infection, cause all kinds of harm, and beyond, um, along with the fact that in one of the articles of the amendments, the WHO would be the one who decides whether or not a vaccine is acceptable, not to mention that they charge.
Yeah, can I just stop you
Sure.
there? Yeah, can I just pause you there, James? I think that's a very, very important connection you've just brought to attention. So, in other words, the restriction is from other countries to your travel, and therefore your constitutional rights aren't being trampled on in your own country because you're not in your own country. But the WHO itself is going to decide unilaterally. I presume its chief scientific officer, who, as I understand it, is Jeremy Farrar, Sir Jeremy Farrar to us mere mortals. They're going to decide on what is an acceptable jab or vaccine, in inverted commas, because the definition of vaccine has changed as well, for us to take in order to get around this problem, and to have your passport in compliance with the WHO rules. Is as straightforward as that?
I would add that there's the testing aspect of it as well. And this was clearly laid out back in November of 2022 when the Indonesian health minister was talking to the members of the B20. And he told what I think are a couple of lies right out of the gate. He said, well, in 2020, we had to lock down the world. Well, no, you didn't. That was a choice, right? And it was, quite frankly, a choice in violation of the ideas behind the international health regulations. Then he
Yeah.
said, well, that hurt the economy. So, well, it didn't really hurt the big companies, it hurt the small mom and pop businesses. And then he said, well, in the future, we want to put in these amendments to the regulations that if you're properly tested or properly jabbed, then you can move around. And so what they're essentially saying is they're forcing people to comply with tests that are, I'll be very generous. They're very, very questionable as to whether or not they truly determine whether someone is a danger to fellow human beings. And the jabs that they want to have, rapidly approved, that again, to just be way too generous, they're entirely questionable as to whether they do what is intended to be done. And so this is something that most people are not talking about. It is in the leaked amendments, and it's in keeping with what the international health regulations are all about. Now, there's much more in these amendments, but that is the one that I think has been neglected severely. That's what the international health regulations are about.
Yeah, I see that. But James, just on the issue of the kind of unilateral, let's call it that, power of the WHO under these regulations, from the document that you've got, it seems to me, and stop me if I'm getting this wrong, the Director General can decide what is an early action alert. We might talk about that for a second. And also, of course, what is a fake, public health emergency of international concern. And it's within his or her, as the case may be, it's a his at the moment, authority to do that. And they can make this declaration. So I find that very difficult to square away with the concept that somehow we're in control of this, but when clearly we're not. I mean, the evidence is there from the last pandemic. We weren't in control of it. This was imposed upon us. And some question I wanted to ask you was, as I understood it, the WHO were arguing for a long time, the last thing that you do for a coronavirus is lock down. That don't do that. So how did they get from don't do that to this, which is the diametric opposite? to where they were. I find that a great puzzle.
There's a lot of questions that are intertwined in your question. I hope I can remember all of the things that just went flying through my head. Number number one, okay, um, there's a difference between an order and something that is enabling. Now, I'll start off by giving a very concrete example with the United States. Every other nation may have something very similar. On the very last day of the Obama administration, on January 19th, 2017, the CDC put in final rulings into our Federal Register regarding these issues, quarantines and all that sort of stuff. And one of the definitions that was in there was what were the requirements that our Secretary of Health and Human Services would have to meet in order for our nation to declare what we call a public health emergency. So it's our health minister declaring an emergency in the United States. Well, one of the things that would not require him to do so, but enable him to do so, give them the regulatory cover to declare an emergency in the United States, is if the Director General declared a public health emergency of international concern or a fake, that's all we
Okay.
would need to do to have this cascade down. It wouldn't be an order. It would enable our health minister to just piggyback on that declaration. Well, the second question that you kind of raised was that what are the requirements for the Director General to declare a public health emergency of international concern? Honestly, not very much. He could override his advisory board as he did with monkeypox and just make that declaration. The only real hindrance to him doing that whenever he wants is that if you cry wolf one too many times, you lose control of that authority. Well, what they want to add to that,
Mm.
you mentioned, they want to add not just a public health emergency of international concern, but an early action alert, and on the other end of the spectrum, not a pandemic, but a pandemic emergency. And so this whole spectrum of, be afraid, be very afraid. Now, in nations' laws, it's probably the case at this point, since this is in flux, nations would have to then say, well, what would our nation be enabled to do when the Director General said there's an early action alert? What would we be enabled to do if there's a pandemic emergency? But people have to realize that this is not an attack on sovereignty. This is enabling
Yeah.
a restriction on your freedoms. Now, I can summarize this in a sentence. Wherever you may live, however you may have been treated over the last 4 years by the officials in your area, you know, local, state, province, nation, whatever, they did not need amendments to the international health regulations, and they did not need a pandemic treaty to abuse your rights and freedoms. They may have said, oh, the WHO said something, and they felt that that gave them legitimacy, but it's not forcing the people in your nation to abuse their citizens.
Mm.
It's a story. It's hypnosis. It's, well, they did it, so we're
It's giving them
giving
cover.
them cover. Exactly. And now they're
Yeah.
getting more.
It's giving them cover. I mean, as you're describing it there, one thing kept running through my mind is that this is Jesuital in its nuance. This is subtle but very powerful. So I mean, yeah, the local health authority, which would be in the Irish case NEFID, as we had it in the last one, they would simply say, well, the WHO have said this and the WHO have said that, and that's the magic wand. I mean, it mightn't have the legal meaning of breach of sovereignty, but it has the de facto a reality
There's
of it
there's
because your freedom is being restricted.
there needs to be a distinction between individual rights and freedoms, and where the problem really started was when the international health regulations were put into place, I think illegitimately. The way I view that is the way it works in most, but not all countries. Okay. What they created with the international health regulations is imagine a huge circular table with 194 delegates sitting around the table. And behind them is the head of state of each nation, whether it's prime minister, president, even the Pope. Okay, that's one of the members. What you have is a global health council that is not in any way, shape, or form accountable to the people. There's no word from your parliament or Congress or Senate or any other legislative body. If that executive council meets during the World Health Assembly, the delegates who go there are generally appointed by the head of state. So it's all in the executive branch of government. They don't necessarily listen to the people and ask for our opinion. There's no legislative vote to determine who gets sent to these meetings. If they make a decision with the amendments to the regulations, your head of state has the authority to reject them for your nation. But you, as you
Mm.
know, collectively the people of the nation, the only way you can influence that is to let the head of state know that you are unhappy with what their council of leaders met in secret and decided. Now, I want to retrace my steps a little bit because in 2022, a series of events happened, and a couple of nations did reject the amendments that were, I think, fraudulently adopted in 2022. Iran and New Zealand, at least, formally rejected amendments that were purportedly adopted in 2022. So, what happened back in 2022 was the Biden administration proposed amendments on January 18th, 2022, just 13 or so articles. And because they did it properly and they submitted those amendments 4 months in advance of the May assembly, the nations had 4 months to review the amendments. And by the time the May assembly rolled around, they let it be known that there was no point in even discussing them. They were rejected out of hand. What happened then was in the middle of the assembly, a number of other nations, along with the US, submitted a different collection of amendments. And on May 28th, 2022, they claimed that they were adopted, but they never held a vote. I mean, it's astonishing that this isn't front page news, the fraudulent, a pretended adoption of a change to an international law. Well, 18 months to the day after that, Rob Roos from the Netherlands and 11 other members of the European Parliament sent a letter to the Director General of the WHO, Tedros, and they said very clearly, we cannot find that there's evidence that these proposed amendments were adopted. Therefore, they are null and void. So it's almost, what, 4 months, I think, that they have not um, responded at all. So the clear illegitimate nature and the behavior of the WHO should be front page news. And in addition to that, in October, with this current series of amendments, their co-chair very clearly stated that they were not going to meet their January deadline. They know that there's a 4 month requirement to present amendments to the international health regulations. Well, that date would have been January 27th, 2024, because the assembly starts on May 27th. And they failed to meet their deadline, and they conspired to just say, well, whatever, we're just going to keep negotiating. They had negotiations at the beginning of February. They had a 1 day meeting in March, and they have meetings scheduled for April 22nd to the 26th. They don't really seem to care about violating their own rules.
But what you're describing then in sort of layman's terms is effectively a kind of a group of people made up of senior civil servants from different branches of government around the world, coming together in secret, deciding on a set of stuff, deciding it without due process, without transparency, without proper voting, and implementing it. And the whole lockdown approach was against the normal rules applied to coronavirus. So have you any view on that, James, about how that pivot happened? We went from no restriction on personal freedom and look after the most vulnerable to just lock down everything. And you had a massive transfer of wealth. I think it was about 4 trillion from the middle classes and low-income groups of the world to the ultra-wealthy.
Oh, I think the only thing I would quibble about was I think it was probably a lot more than 4 trillion. It's hard to know what that number is. You're absolutely right. All of the preparedness plans said that was not the way to go. The international health regulations as a recommendation to how nations should behave was just thrown out the window. Nations essentially, whether they panicked or it was a planned response to achieve a nefarious end, that's a discussion that we can go on and on about. The issue really is, what is it that they're attempting to achieve with the negotiations to change the international health regulations? Well, what they're trying to do is make it so that nations are less likely to put restrictions on each other, nation to nation, and they're trying to make those restrictions very personal. If you want to travel and you show up and try to disembark, the term they use is a conveyance, right? In their lingo, in Article 1 of the International Health Regulations, a conveyance is a ship or an airplane or a bus or a train, any sort of transport vehicle. And the conveyance operators in Article 42 would be required to abide by whatever rules your local tyrant would enforce. And so I've heard from many people around the world that a lot of money is being spent at ports of call, whether it's a shipping port, where a cruise boat might dock, or airports, that facilities are being built for quarantine. And this is what it appears that they are doing, which is within the framework of the international health regulations. If you understand what that document is, it's not about health. If you just read the titles of the articles, it really should be called the International Surveillance, Monitoring, Reporting, Emergency Declaring, Fear-Mongering, and Control Regulations. They want to set it up so that your nation can abuse the citizens of every other nation when they attempt to travel internationally.
I mean, this is the melding of an international institution under, depending on who's funding. And of course, the Gates Foundation is €1 in every 5 running through it. Getting together with the people that implement these things in various countries and controlling, setting up a set of rules where everybody benefits as they may, from a profit perspective, but at the cost of our freedoms. I mean, it's extraordinary. Just so far, what I've learned, right, is that the Director General can unilaterally declare what is an early action alert or a pandemic emergency. And then this whole thing clicks in. Local governments say, well, yes, look, listen, we can make our own rules here, but listen, the Director General has made this declaration. This is very serious. We have to have due account of what other countries are doing, and then they'll go to the very civil servants that have signed the agreements and given up this authority. I'm using layman's terms, not legal terms here. And one of the most things that absolutely just jumped off the page when I was studying the material that you were producing is that they now want individual countries to gather together their, like as if they were public resources to go and find these pathogens, analyze them, pass them into the kind of central laboratory so that they can then flick them over to the pharmaceutical companies to generate the remedies, the vaccines. I hate using the term vaccine because they changed the definition, but to come up with some kind of a drug that allegedly provides some kind of protection against the very pathogen that they're enhancing themselves in their own in their own laboratories. I mean, to me, it's absolutely outrageous that this institution is saying, let's find more of this stuff. It's worked so well the last time. I mean, is that my reading of it, or am I over-reading it?
Not at all. I'll just make one clarification. So up until what you just said, primarily we've been talking about what is in the amendments to the international health regulations. Let me summarize those, because while that is also in the amendments, it's very predominant in the new agreement. So to summarize what they're talking about, in the amendments, I put together rejecttheamendments.com. There's 10 points. First and foremost is the Director General could declare, not just a public health emergency of international concern, but an early action alert and a pandemic emergency. The changes that I think more people need to be focused on and talking about are the addition of the terms quarantine in Articles 24 and 27. Now, I want to make it clear that this is not presented as an order telling your national officials that they have to do anything. It's being presented as a recommendation, and you use the term, it would give them cover. And depending upon your local, country or provincial laws, how each jurisdiction would handle that would, use that as an excuse, but it would not be that they are telling you or your doctor or anyone else that they have to. But the way propaganda works, that's what happened last time. There were no orders given. There was a statement made. The media says, oh, the WHO said you got to do this. And then in the United States, oh, the FDA or the NIH or the CDC or somebody said this and somebody said that. And by the time it filters down to the person not knowing any better has accepted that statement as being an authoritative order, when no one ever has the authority to have anybody do anything to their body, but they use coercion and bribery and blackmail. Oh, you're going to lose your job or you can't travel. So they're trying to institute this in a stronger way in international travel, where, if you're trying to get off the cruise boat, but the captain has to submit documentation that everyone has passed a test and they're free to leave the boat, you might not be allowed to go. They have language in here that says that it could be implemented either on the craft or on land, and so they're putting money into building those facilities to be able to restrain the movement of people when they travel internationally. Now, that makes it difficult to argue that it's unconstitutional. These people are very savvy. It's a violation of our human rights, no doubt, but they're working their way through, a wedge between nations where many people, and I'll just speak for the United States, they'll say something like, well, look at our southern border. People are just coming across. But if you come in legally, you could be quarantined if you don't pass a test. That's very questionable, or you don't have proof of an injection that was approved by the WHO. And so this is the problem. We need to focus on the actual real problem.
No, but that's what I was getting to. I mean, that's what I said. It is Jesuital in its sneakiness. I mean, it's so subtle. It's masterful, really. If you're of that mindset to implement something like this, but what I would say to somebody, getting used to this material for the first time is that, well, all we have to do is go back and look at what happened the last time. I mean, we went from a scare to Italy, Lombardy locking down, Italy locking down. There was, millions and millions going to be killed according to the models, which we all know was nonsense. The PCR tests suddenly arrived onto the scene. They were at an extreme area of level of magnification. So, I mean, all that is now only becoming apparent in hindsight. But I mean, we went from we might have a problem here to lockdown. It just seemed to happen, in a matter of days, or I know it was a bit longer than that, but it all happened so quick. There was no chance to take a breath and have national debates and decide, well, what are we going to do here? It was just implemented, and that was it. It was game over before we even knew it. And then the fear was kept up through massive power coming through mainstream media and deplatforming people that were coming up with counter narratives or counter science. I mean, that's what happened. And there's no reason to believe, on the basis of what we're discussing, that it's going to be any different the next time.
And that is exactly the problem. The phrase that they used at the time was, "Oh, this was just going to be for 2 weeks. We need 2 weeks to flatten the curve." The idea was, oh, if it happened too quickly, it would overwhelm, the medical establishment. And so if we just spread out the pain, right, then that would somehow be better. So I've adapted that in my latest article that summarizes all of this, is 2 months to flatten the who. We've got about 2 months to get people to be aware of what is going on. So let's draw that line in the sand right now, Eddie. And you mentioned a
Okay.
little something which is very much about this new agreement. And so I think people need to realize why these negotiations are actually happening. Now, it goes all the way back, many, many years, where there was something called the Independent Panel that was put together by the WHO. And in May of 2021, they put out their report of the Independent Panel. I did a video summary of it a couple of years ago. And essentially, what they said was that they recommended that there be a framework convention, and that they would need, on an ongoing basis, $31 billion a year and surge financing capacity for an emergency of up to $100 billion. Now, that's the framework convention idea that is built into what some people may be familiar with, the Framework Convention for Climate Change. Well, believe what you want about climate change. The manner in which it is being addressed is that all of the nations, 193 member nations of the United Nations, have signed on from the 1992 Framework Convention for Climate Change. On a yearly basis, they have a meeting, the Conference of the Parties, and again, unelected, unaccountable, appointed, bureaucrats go and have a party, and they have a meeting once a year, and whatever they decide becomes part of the framework. If you agree to a blank contract, if you sign a blank check, and then say, well, we'll figure that out later, don't be surprised if some of the ideas that you find yourself obligated to implement are absolutely insane. Now, regardless of what anybody thinks about climate change, putting unelected, unaccountable, unknown, I mean, do you know who represented your nation? Okay. This is what they want to set up with a framework convention for the pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. They want to set up a whole new bureaucracy, put $30 billion a year into the kitty, and have all of these decisions made on an ongoing basis. Now, the framework that they're debating today and the next 2 weeks until the 28th of March centers around pretty much what you said. And I wanted to make sure people were clear that there's pieces of that in the amendments to the regulations, but most of what you said
Hmm.
is in this new agreement. And it reads like an organized crime syndicate. I've actually referred to it as the new OPEC. OPEC is currently the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. Well, the new OPEC is the Organization of Pandemic Emergency Corporations. What they want to do is put billions of dollars into what they call the One Health approach, which is really One Health surveillance. They want every scrap of genetic information that they can get from humans, animals, plants, everything. They're looking for the next pathogen with pandemic potential, But the way I read it, it's the next pathogen with pandemic profiteering potential. They want to bring all of these pathogens that they might get from, swabs up someone's nose or other orifices, or if you take your companion animal to the veterinarian and they take a stool sample. They're literally, in the United States, they're surveilling wastewater. They, at sewage treatment plants, wastewater from airplanes that fly internationally, maybe your chicken coop or your pigsty or your local, bat cave, or whatever else you might find, to bring them into what they call the WHO Coordinated Laboratory Network. They want to have biolabs all over the world that are looking for pathogens, sequencing the genome to be handed over to their central biohub, where here's where the sticking point is in their negotiations. They want to set up what they call a pathogen access and benefit sharing system. And where this really comes from is, if you go all the way back to the beginning of 2020, there was a genetic sequence that was claimed to be the Wuhan Institute of Virology 1, quote unquote, virus. Whether you believe viruses or the terrain theory, that's almost, not the point. They claimed that there was a genetic sequence. They handed over that digital information, changed the name to SARS-CoV-2, because calling it Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 was a little bit incriminating. And Moderna, over a weekend, turned that into a jab that was worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So if you could be the person who finds the next scary pathogen, they literally say in the treaty document that those biological resources are part of a nation's sovereign resources. And so what this is about is the new gold rush. It's not looking for gold or diamond mine or drilling for oil or, whatever other kind of natural resources might be exploited. The new gold rush is to find the genetic sequence or craft it in a computer that's very scary, so that you can turn that over to the pharmaceutical companies, have them sign a standard material transfer agreement contract that they're going to share the benefits. Now, where this really comes from is Omicron. When South Africa and Botswana identified the Omicron genetic sequence and they just publicly made it available, they were greeted with travel restrictions. And that was what the IHR was supposed to prevent. They were transparent, gave all the information, and boom, their economy suffered. That's not supposed to happen under the IHR, but obviously it did. Then, to add insult to injury, Pfizer and Moderna took that information, incorporated it into the boosters, and made a couple of more $1 billion. So, in the amendments originally submitted more than a year and a half ago, the African nations said very clearly, we're not giving you any stinking pathogen information unless you promise benefits. And so what you're really looking at is the attempt to structure a dynamic and an infrastructure that is part of the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex that would profiteer from the next pandemic. Now, the WHO doesn't want to be set up to tell your doctor how to treat you. They want to be set up to control the logistics and the distribution network, where they would hand out all of the contracts and run the distribution network to supply whatever they say is needed. And so Tedros said at the World Government Summit a couple of weeks ago that the WHO already has a 20,000 square meter distribution hub in Dubai, and that's just one of their 6 regions. Can you imagine the corruption that could ensue if you put the Conference of the Parties in charge of making their own financial rules, which is what it says in the document, and distributing $30 billion a year to fill up distribution hubs all around the world and hand out all those contracts to their cronies. Now, once you fill up the distribution hub, you gotta rotate your product. You need an emergency to take some of that product and send it to where you claim to need to use it, so you can order up another batch next year and keep all that money flowing. What we're looking at here, it's a business model, and the same Indonesian health minister back at the B20 in November of 2022 laid it all out very succinctly. He was talking about a different thing that's happening in the United States. The US Defense Department worked with a number of nations and the World Bank to create the Pandemic Fund. That's been in existence since 2022. But in November of 2022, the Indonesian health minister knew about it. And when he was talking to the business leaders in Bali, he said, look, they've got this multi-billion-dollar fund. They're going to be building out these laboratory networks and surveillance and all these many things. This is a spectacular business opportunity. Go invest. And so what happened the next month is Congress in the United States passed, and then Biden signed, our National Defense Authorization Act. That's the Defense Department's budget. Well, we have in there $5 billion over the next 5 years to start building this infrastructure. And in 2023, they distributed $340 million to 37 nations, because we don't want to build those biolabs in our country. We're building them all everywhere else. And so the idea, quite frankly, is, would you prefer to have the United States Defense Department or the WHO be in charge of the proliferation of biological weapons? The answer is neither of these things. This needs to stop. The seeking out of pathogens to be brought into laboratories to find the genetic sequences to make, mRNA jabs that don't do what a vaccine is supposed to do needs to stop.
So what we're looking at here then is where nation states are being encouraged to get together in these annual conferences to chat with one another, to senior civil servants raising hands and voting on stuff without us even looking in on top of it, because that's how they do their business. And that nation states then go and, just like looking for gold in the hills or uranium or tin, are actually looking for these pathogens, take them into laboratories, gain a function, jimmy them up, make them more powerful to generate the response, and then figure out what the vaccine is, the drugs that can match that, and then manufacture that, put it in within 100 days, go jab the whole world all over again, make a bucket load of money, and just wash, rinse, and repeat. I mean, it's extraordinary that after everything we now know about the pandemic of COVID and all of the problems and questions that remain unanswered and will be answered, that here we are. It's like a lunge just to magnify up the power that's there to something that is Orwellian in its concept. And that somehow that nations of the world are just going to sit back and just say, well, go on with it. I find it absolutely extraordinary that this is not being discussed in the mainstream media. I know the reasons why, I can figure it out, but it's just absolutely jaw-dropping that in audacity.
I think you're going to have your producer edit out what you just said, because that's a very succinct summary of what is really going on. Now, if I painted a little picture for you, right? If a friend of yours called you up and said that a long ago friend of theirs is coming over for dinner and they wanted to meet you because they were a multi-billionaire and they were in a very generous mood, you might head over and share a couple of beers with them, right? Well, if you set the table and you invite 194 nations to show up at the table and you say, we're going to have billions of dollars that we're going to be distributing, would you like in on the deal? So what's going on here are not negotiations about how to make people healthier. What these negotiations are about is how to divvy up this evil, toxic pie. The nations that did not profit from COVID and shared their genetic information that was turned into profits by Pfizer, Moderna, and maybe a bunch of other companies have said, no, 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 no. We want in on the deal. And so what we're dealing with here is a corruption beyond anything imaginable, where the WHO doesn't care what happens to you with your doctor. Once they do the deal, get the fear mongering going, have the contracts in place to make the products and distribute them, the money is flowing through their pandemic fund. After they deliver the products to your nation, it's up to their cronies in your nation to try to get them into your arms. They don't care about you, they care about the profit. And so if you can distinguish in your mind that this is a trade agreement. Now, in the United States, a lot of people walk around with a pocket constitution and they go, oh, the Constitution says, we have these rights and freedoms. That's maybe true, but you got to read Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which is commonly known as the Commerce Clause. Each nation, in exercising its national sovereignty, especially in the United States, the federal government has the authority to regulate international trade. That's what this agreement actually is, but it would set up this cabal, this conference of the parties, where all of the insiders who attend these meetings attend them so that they can be on the receiving end of the contracts. You and I are not going to get a piece of that. What they want to do is take money in the form of either taxes or national debt from poor people in rich countries and put it into a fund where they can distribute it to rich people in poor countries. This isn't about helping poor people in some far off land. This is about building out the infrastructure so that the oligarchs in the global south can profit by manufacturing fear and then manufacturing products that they can inflict upon their own people.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. This business model, then, right? We can only go on what's happened so far to say, well, how would it work the next time? Informed consent was just completely ditched, and the Hippocratic Oath completely ditched. There was I find it ironic they're calling it one health, because it's just one jab for all. No one's safe until we're all safe. The same thing will happen all over again. Doctors who are supposed to, trained to customize their medical response to whatever they've got with their patient, were just incentive. They were paid as well, of course, a lot of them, to actually just jab and not ask questions. It's absolutely extraordinary that all these millions of doctors that have gone through years and years of training and genuflect before the Hippocratic Oath, just bent it. Some exceptions, but hardly a murmur. So if the medical profession itself isn't prepared to stand up at this stage with all the data and information coming through and saying, we can't do this, we can't go through all that again, then what have we got? What have we got, James, in the health system?
I think, Eddie, you can, I hope, agree that in many ways in the world, what you think is the case and what you think certain things are, oftentimes you get the red pill and you realize, oh, that's not what I thought it was. I encourage all of your listeners to look up the history of the Hippocratic Oath. It is not what you think it is. I can almost guarantee you're going to have a head explosion when you realize really what the original Hippocratic Oath was, and the corruption that is in the education system of the medical establishment. The WHO is essentially a marketing arm for big pharma. And medical doctors, while there are maybe a couple of good ones, their fundamental philosophy is, well, tell me what your symptoms are. I don't want to deal with the cause. Here, take a poison that'll change your symptoms. You could either swallow it or you can inject it to protect you against something that you don't have, but we've made you afraid of. And so until people realize that the business model of the medical profession and the pharmaceutical industry behind it does not give a damn about you and your health. It's a money-making venture, and their products cause more disease than they help. They're designed to poison people to treat symptoms. Now, there's always exceptions, right? But here's what people need to do. Ask yourself, what percentage of the population in Ireland makes their living through that industry? Pharmaceuticals have their tentacles all throughout the developed world. And so we're not really fighting against the WHO. They're just the marketing arm for the beast of pharmakia. And until people look in the mirror and realize that if you wake up every day and you swallow a couple of poisons in pursuit of health, you might want to look into the statistics that correlate death from COVID and the number of pharmaceutical medications that people were on. The people who were vulnerable, in many cases, many of the statistics bear out, that the people who had, remember the term comorbidities, right? People who had comorbidities or
Yeah.
multiple comorbidities were more, it's not because they had comorbidities. It's because in the treatment of those comorbidities, they were swallowing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 drugs every day. They're in a senior home, being slowly murdered with poisons from the pharmaceutical industry. And they got a respiratory infection. They got remdesivir or midazolam or whatever other drugs. It's not COVID that killed them. It's pharmakia and the system that is designed to profiteer off of your fear. And they're trying to put that into an international agreement that is just, corruption being enshrined in law. And when people, I have every faith that regular men, regular women, and really regular children, if you just explain this to them and let them see what these documents actually say, it's obvious. But if you profit, but if you profit from it, that's who's sitting at the table trying to get a piece of the pie.
Yeah, it's just quite extraordinary, when you blend real top level, heavy hitting, behemoths corporations with these type of institutions. You end up with a kind of a modern day, in the purest term, modern day kind of fascist model, which is exactly what the words I think you quoted from Mussolini from back in the day exactly describes what we've been talking about here for the
And
last
that
hour.
definition has been enhanced. Mussolini defined fascism as corporations and government working hand in hand to essentially abuse and control the people. In the 21st century, they've added all of these non-government organizations and foundations. And if you pay attention to the meetings that they're having for these negotiations, there are 400 organizations that are considered relevant stakeholders. So they get a chance to sit in on some of the meetings, they get a chance to be in the building and have these discussions that would carry over into the yearly conference of the parties. The reason why they want to be at the table is because they want to get a piece of the pie. You and I would be called upon to either pay taxes or go into debt so that our government would be tricked into putting money into the fund that those bureaucrats would distribute to their cronies in the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex, build out the industry to find the pathogens that they would then scare you with in the amendments. Now, the Director General could declare an early action alert all over the world all the time. You'd be playing whack-a-mole. Here's the problem, here's the problem, here's the problem. And if the local officials are compliant and the local people are coerced into harming themselves out of fear, then the stories will be put over on the media. Oh, be very afraid. Look what's happening here and what's happening here and what's happening here. It's just setting up an industry of fear.
Yeah, and then of course you get the propaganda side of it. Then anybody comes up with a counter narrative. Listen, I'm going to stop it there, James. I'll tell you, you've done a great job in explaining it, and thank you so much. For those watching this in Ireland and the UK, we get UK listeners and watchers as well. How can they connect with the information that you're providing? What website did they go to? How do they reach you?
Everything is on jamesroguski.substack.com. The only hard part is spelling my name, JamesRoguski. Roguski. I've put together a simple overview. I think this is an even simpler overview, but all of the facts in the documents are on stopthewho.com. And I have a massive activist toolbox on exitthewho.org. And I encourage everyone, I live in California. You can call me directly, text me, Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp. That's how Eddie and I got connected. 310-619-3055. Happy to answer anybody's questions, provide the information that you might need to comprehend what's going on. Just realize that it's ever changing. They're negotiating as we speak. We've got 2 months to flatten their plans. So one of the latest articles is 2 months to flatten the WHO. All anybody really needs to do is take this video or audio, podcast, however you are listening or watching this, and share it with absolutely everybody. Step number one is always awareness, because the vast majority of the population is paying attention to their lives, and if we make them aware, things will change if we spread the word. And all you got to do is share this video or audio and let everybody know what you've been blessed to know by listening to this.
Okay, James Roguski, thank you so much. And when this thing finally comes out of the oven and lands, we might talk again and compare and contrast to what's landed versus what looks like. I mean, it's almost finished now, I know, but I think it's a good opportunity to put the foot on the ball at that stage, look around and say, no, what are we dealing with?
All the time.
Okay, James, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Well, if you've enjoyed Counterpoint, please subscribe by clicking the button below. See you next time.